So I would like to welcome everyone to the panel discussion of session 1 on the experiences learned and perspectives on using model integrated evidence in the regulatory context. This is the first session of our workshop, and it will be regulated by myself, Eleftheria, Tsakalozou, and Dr. Liang, Zhao. Before we begin with the discussion, I would like to introduce additional panelists that will join our speakers to this panel discussion. I would like to welcome Dr. Tausif Ahmed. He's currently working as a Vice President and Head Biopharmaceutics and Bioequivalence in the Global Clinical Management Group, IPDO, at Dr. Reddy's Laboratories. He's responsible for managing all bioequivalence studies supporting global complex generic products. Mr. Pradeep Bhadauria, he's the President and Global Chief Scientific Officer at CIPLA. In his current role, he leads CIPLA's Global Integrated Product Development Organization to strengthen the company's position as an innovation-driven generic biosimilars and specialty pharmaceutical organization. Our panel is also joined by Dr. Robert Lionberger, who is the Director of the Office of Research and Standards at OGD. He leads OGD's implementation of the GDUFA science and research commitments, which includes internal research activities and external research grants and collaborations. Our panel is also Dr. Rostami, Dr. Amin Rostami is also joining our panel. He's Professor of Systems Pharmacology and Director of CRPKR at the University of Manchester. The scientific work of Professor Rostami covers wide areas of drug development over the last 30 years, and it ranges from pharmaceutics to clinical pharmacology and systems pharmacology. And our last panelist for today is Dr. Chung. He's currently working at Apotex as Chief Scientific Officer, Biopharmaceutics and Biostatistics. He's currently the chair of the Bioequivalence Committee in the Canadian Generic Pharmaceutical Association and the past chair of the Generic Pharmaceuticals Focus Group of the American Association of Pharmaceutical Scientists. I would also like to remind our audience that they can type their questions in the chat box. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. We have received some already, and they're in our radar for our discussion, but we encourage your active participation throughout the panel discussion here. And now I believe that we can move on to a couple of questions, topics that we would like to cover during this time. So I would like to extend this first question maybe to Dr. Rostami. We would like to get your opinion on what are the challenges that you see in implementing modeling and simulation in the development program of generic drug products. Do you see challenges in the model validation aspect of it? What is your opinion? What are your thoughts? Good morning. Yes, we can hear you very well.
I mean, you are double muted. You need also unmute from the computer.
We can still hear him though.
No, I cannot hear him.
Oh no.
Yeah. So also need to unmute from Zoom, the mute button.
Liang,
I mean, yeah,
Liang, you were right. You know, I was.
We lost you again. I mean.
Is it okay now?
Good.
There's sort of like an echo. Dr. Rostami, do you mind muting yourself back on Zoom and use just your headphones for the sound?
I think it is because of the team. You know, I don't know which one to mute and which.
You are muted again.
It seems I have to mute the team one.
Yeah, you just mute
Sure.
the team.
Try that, yeah.
Okay, I mute the team.
I mean, you also muted the Zoom. I think you
No, the Zoom is all right, Liang.
Now we can hear you. Good, great.
Yes, we can hear
echo
you.
from my
Okay,
side.
you know, sort
Please
of
go ahead.
I think with this example, I think the problems with the I would say application or modeling simulation are multifaceted, exactly as we saw with the mute buttons. We have to figure out, you know, sort of different elements and bring them forward at the same time. So if you only focus on one side of the issues, this is never going to happen. So I would say when we are only focusing on the model, you know, in itself, or verification, validation, etc., we are missing some other elements, such as, you know, whether the in general generic industry, they do have the capacity actually taking this forward, what they need to do. So there are elements of the management of this and bringing to fruition that they are not just necessarily focused on the model and its verification, etc., but also to bring, you know, the people who are going to do that within the industry. And as a result of that, of course, tomorrow we are going to discuss. I'm a big fan of this model master file, because that basically removes some of those hurdles that they are basically relying on the management of the models, particularly high-level models that we are talking about. So basically, our hurdles, they are not just one or two, but yes, starting with the models, I think once the elements of the models that they are common, they are settled, we should not waste our time on basically redoing them. And also, when I think they are settled, we have got people that they can with trust to use them going forward, and then, you know, they don't have to reinvent the wheel and start from beginning and actually take, you know, unnecessary time. I hope, you know, with, you know, this example, you know, that I brought, and the, you know, the issues that we had with the microphone, people, you know, appreciate that there are many different pieces that we have to address at the same time.
Definitely, these are very good points. Pradeep, to see if any inputs. You can expand beyond the validation, or please feel free to share.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so at least the model seems to be working in this case, so that's good. Yeah, so I think I would like to add to what was told by the previous speaker. I think from the industry's perspective, from the generic industry perspective in particular, I think the capabilities do exist, right, in bits and pieces. And obviously, when you try to do something new, obviously you will also have to take that additional burden of building the capabilities. And when you see the entire universe of the capability existed in your organization and externally available and working with agencies like FDA, I think I would say that on capability front, we are making a significant progress. An agency has really helped industry crossing that bridge. Now, from the particular standpoint, there are 2 or 3 points that I would like to make here. The first and foremost, I think from generic industry perspective, in general, one of the dilemma that industry has is there is no clear-cut, step-by-step best practices document of sort exists today, right? For example, for validation, what is acceptable, right? So typically we follow V and V40 standard, right? And then what adds to the complexity is that the requirement, obviously, for the internal and external validation, right? So external validation in particular becomes very, very challenging at times, because sometimes the reliable data is not available. And many times this whole gambit of the modeling and simulation becomes even more complicated when we talk about the locally acting product, right? Because that's where the regional deposition pattern, multiple options are available, computational fluid dynamics related data that can feed into the model. So, and sometimes, you know, the metabolic path of the drug can also complicate the model itself, right? So when you put all these things together, a question comes in anybody's mind when we see it in terms of the return on investment from the industry perspective, that we are working on something new with a lot of unknowns. Acceptance criteria is not very well defined and predefined. Timing of doing all these studies, which will ultimately become a feed to the model, when I encompass all these things and the resources required, the question comes in my mind is that, am I better off running the clinical study itself? So at least that will make sure that I'm not dealing with any kind of fear of unknown. And at least the approval path will be much more predictable. We have seen that many times when the model-based application you submit, you have to go through many iterations working with agency. And that ultimately also delays the approval path itself. So there are multiple factors here.
Thank you. We appreciate that. Michiel?
Yeah, I hear and acknowledge everything that's being said, but obviously we are trying to build experience and we are lacking experience yet. So that's the struggle we are in with. I would like to bring two other views to this topic. I think when we're talking about model validation in this setting, we need a clear context of use. That's I think, what are we going to use the model for? That's for regulatory perspective very important. So that's, I think, the starting point of a model verification or validation, having a clear context of use. What are we going to use, generalize the data for? And then one other point, I think it's not applicable to all sorts of uses, but something to repeat is that a model is as good as the underlying data. So we need good data in general for good models. Thank you.
Thank you, Michiel. Tausif? Any
Yeah,
additional
thank
comments?
you. Hope I'm audible.
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Yeah, so I think I just want to touch base on some of the practical challenges. I think in addition to what already other eminent panelists have said, see, one challenge is that in a generic industry, time is essence and speed is an essence. So when we are talking of validation, we need to kind of have formulations with different release rates. We need to have kind of data where our model can distinguish non-BE batches. So you need to have a failed BE or a formulation which has failed BE to validate the model. These are some of the challenges where we end up. I mean, we can validate the literature data, we can validate some in-house data, but having non-BE batches is one challenge. Some of other challenges are like when the in vitro dissolution is not predictive of the in vivo behavior. We talk of the biorelevant media versus or biopredictive media versus QC media. That is one major challenge. And lastly, I would also touch base when we are developing or the model, some of the parameters like the enzymes and transporter information may not be available to plug into the model. Those are some of the challenges we see in terms of practically validating the model and using it for a specific application.
We appreciate the feedback. Anybody else that would like to chime in? Okay. Yes.
This is Rob. I have a question.
Yes,
I really appreciate our generic industry colleagues coming here and discussing about the challenges. So I'd like to if possible, I'd like to hear more about like some of you mentioned, like, well, I'm worried about the validation, right? Because that sort of implies I'm going to submit something to FDA. Can you talk a little bit about as much as you're able to about how you would use the modeling and simulation internally on your own decisions? Like you mentioned, well, I can't use the model because I don't know what the enzymes and the transporters are doing. But then how do you do the BE study if you don't know what you must have some, some aspect of this. If you say, well, oh, I don't want to use the model, I'm going to go directly to my in vivo study, right? I'm curious about the internal use of, like, well, which dissolution rate should I put into my in vivo study? Like, what's the current state of the use of modeling approaches before you even say, I'm going to use this to ask FDA to do something? What about your internal use, which doesn't have to there you are responsible for, is this fit for my own purpose, right? You don't have to ask us to sort of come up with some questions. So I'm curious your perspective on that.
Thank you. I'll take a shot at it. So, see, again, we are talking of two aspects. See, one is this modeling has been very well developed as a capability in the NC research. In the generic industry, we are kind of getting up to speed, and there are two aspects or two thoughts which goes into generic industry. See, one is I'll do n number of pilot studies to kind of arrive at the best formulation. That is one traditional approach. But the approach which we use with these sophisticated tools is primarily from a BE risk assessment or a confidence building. See, even if we go into a pilot study, I mean, it will give us some insights, but before the pilot study is my in vitro media, which I have used, any of the critical bioavailability attributes which are impacting, which can be looked into. So we used it for our internal decision making, for shortlisting the formulations, and before going into the bio study as a phase gate or a stage gate to even get into a actual human study. See, even being in India, I mean, it's like cost effective to do the studies, but even the ethical aspects comes into it. So we don't want to do unnecessary human studies, be it pilot studies. So to answer your question in short, one, we use for internal risk assessment, and secondly, to minimize the number of the clinical PK studies for which to minimize the human exposure. So these are the prime intent we use modeling in our internal processes.
That's helpful. Thank you. Chung?
Want to a quick comment? Yeah, I want to echo what Pradeep have said earlier. You know, not knowing what's clearly required by regulatory agencies or what the criteria of validations are is problematic because of the concern that the effort of validation may negate the time and cost saving of using modeling and simulation in the development program. So I think that's something perhaps the regulatory agency could help the industry is to clearly lay out the requirements. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Rostami?
2 points to bring up. I think sometimes, people talk about, sort of decisions without realizing perhaps that any decisions that we are making is all the time on the basis of models. So I think, talking about models, and not defining that integration of any information and coming to a conclusion is a model, I think a little bit, sort of, I think, aspect that I don't see why we should be in that position to believe that without model, we can make a decision. So any decision that we are making is on the basis of a model, but we don't declare that model. So the only thing that we are asking here is declaring that model. And this happens with any submission to FDA. If you are bringing, FDA colleagues should talk about that, but if you are bringing anything to any regulator, and the same with the EMA, if you are bringing something and then, saying that I am going to do it this way or that way, you have to justify what you are saying on the basis of some evidence, integration of information, etc. This is no more than what we are all the time doing from logical perspective. Now, going to the uncertainty element, that's what, basically I talked about. I think people are talking about the level of the complexity of these models and whether, sort of, there are going to be every element of it going to be uncertain or not. And the solution actually is offered, I think, by the FDA colleagues with regard to separation of some elements of these decisions that we are talking about and removing the uncertainty from that part and basically saying, okay, we have got enough experience. In the case of EMA, hopefully that will be built also soon. But the remaining part are what we are going to actually look at. Otherwise, yes, I agree that it becomes very, very scary process if you are going with a complex set of integration and modeling, and then you are expecting every aspect of it, to be part of the negotiation and so on.
Thank you, Dr. Rostami. I have a follow-up question to what Tausif said and Pradeep maybe. So you mentioned earlier that you do consider modeling and simulation, and you also, as you move on with your product development program, you use modeling approaches to select your candidate, basically your final formulation. So I'm wondering if you are considering combining these two, bringing these two together. So as you move on with your product development program, do you identify risks that you can then try to address by modeling and simulation? And at the same time, once you make the decision to incorporate modeling and simulation into your program, you start building your data set, you start collecting the relevant data that you will need to inform that model. I mean, at the agency, I think we appreciate that when we see that modeling and simulation is considered and then it is informed by evidence that is collected throughout the, and it is a targeted and it's a conscious and comprehensive data collection that is relevant to model building. This definitely increases our confidence as when we see it in a submission. Is this something that you are entertaining, you're moving towards? Any comments or thoughts on that?
Yes, so maybe I will start and others can add to that. I think the question that Rob was asking earlier, that that this fear around modeling and simulation, and what are the current practices within the industry today. So the reality is that that we are currently, as it stands today, we are using part of the modeling and simulation already in our practices as a predictive tool, right? Mm-hmm. So for example, if you're developing a product and if you want to dose that product for your first PK study, you're not going to dose the first PK study without any assumptions and any prediction, right? So where that core data for prediction is coming, that is coming from in vitro studies, right? And then we further optimize those in vitro studies and model whether it's an oral product, whether it's a poorly soluble product, or it's a, let's say, for example, if it's a respiratory product, then you're going to see the regional deposition pattern, etc. But based on the in vitro, you are making your preliminary decision, right? And essentially, once you dose your first PK study, pilot study, or whatever you want to call, or Pathfinder, once you get the results from that pilot study, it is nothing but partially validating your assumptions, right? Whether your assumptions were right or not. Even if the outcome of the pilot study is not favorable, you will still be able to utilize that data to build this construct from this information, prior information, and keep building it. And the next iteration, you will be able to optimize it a little bit more. Now, what is missing is currently a framework where all this information, including the historical development information, that can go in a systemic way and as an effort to build a model around it, right? So that that model can be used again and again, because I think Amin talked about reusability of the model, etc. I think that is the direction I see ultimately industry heading towards, right? Because I always believe that, see, modeling simulation will also require a lot of scientific efforts. It will also require a lot of studies we have to do on side batches, slow, medium, target, and faster dissolution, etc. So we are going to have a lot of efforts needed here as well. I think what will help, again, I would like to reiterate, what will really help is that if we can have a little bit of more granular level clarity from agency, kind of a step-by-step approach, a decision-making tree, right? Without getting into too much of micro detail, I think that will help industry. And the second thing is that somewhere, I think a public acknowledgement that the modeling and simulation based work has resulted in successful approvals also, right? Mm-hmm. That will also boost the confidence of the industry. And that's how the applicability is gonna become widespread.
Dr. Fang, would you like to share your thoughts on the framework that Pradeep discussed?
Oh, actually, yeah, thank you, Eleftheria. I really like the question that we just discussed, how we can actually work together to really build this framework. I think what I'm hearing is our industry colleagues is actively developing, using modeling simulation for your internal use, such as predictive tools, such as risk assessment. I think what we want to more from you is when you accumulate those experience and you share those with us, so we can work together to help you refine those. So I think that's the so-called like the direction I would like to see more happening in that direction. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. And then another follow-up question on what we have been discussing. So when you are applying modeling and simulation in your product development programs, how do you determine the role of the model? That ties up to Michiel's comment earlier, that what we expect in regulatory agencies is to see a clearly defined role of the model. This is, at least from our side, the guiding principle for all the considerations around model development and especially model validation. So you said that you are incorporating modeling and simulation in your program. So is this also the guiding principle for you?
Yeah, it is. It is actually. If you will see, I think it is one of the guiding principle. I think to elaborate a little bit more, I think what typically happens if we want to use the modeling and simulation as a strategy to support the future ANDA filing, what typically we do, and you're very well familiar with the process, is that we have the pre-development meeting, pre-ANDA meeting, where we put the framework in front of agency, right? This is our potential hypothesis. Like, for example, if I can take in the context of there is a lot of discussion happened in the previous speakers were talking about orally inhaled product, right? For example, so then we obviously the industry is going to propose a potential paths here, right? So maybe a regional deposition pattern that can be predicted, right? Which can substitute an expensive clinical study, right? Second possibility could be you can use other modern tool like a computational fluid dynamics based modeling, right? So you can, so typically what we do from industry perspective is that we put our option 1, option 2, option 3 proposals. And then we have these pre-development and pre-ANDA meetings, which in my opinion are very, very crucial and very, very successful. Industry experience could be slightly here and there, but my personal experience has been that tool is a very, very important tool. And that is where I think industry and agency can work together to build that process and build those initial meetings and make those initial meetings more effective, because that is where the industry is going to get confidence that, hey, if I have to choose an alternative path versus a longer, well-established path of the running clinical endpoint study, why should I take a bet on the alternative path, right?
Okay, so that's great. So I have a follow-up on that one. What do you think are the points, the aspects of these meetings that can improve? How do you think we can improve these interactions?
So that is a very good question. I'm glad that you asked that question. And again, as I said many times in public forum, Miss Agency has been very, very helpful to most of our industry colleagues will pretty much echo the same sentiment. I think what can get better, in my opinion, I think I have seen a pretty contrast in my practical experience, right? So we have this pre-development meeting and pre-ANDA meeting, and then we have a mid-cycle review meeting, right? I found many times that the mid-cycle review meetings are way, way more useful, right? Because that is where you are getting a more definitive kind of a go, no-go decision, or at least it is directing you in that path, right? whether this is acceptable, this is not acceptable, this is where you have to do more. In my opinion, some of the element which makes the mid-cycle review meeting more effective, if those elements can be incorporated in the pre-development meeting, and we can get more robust feedback in the beginning, I think that will pave the way for the success.
Thank you. Dr. Zhao.
Pradeep, this Liang, I think you have a serious question I was about to ask. Can you be more granular in terms of the elements you want to be integrated in the pre-submission interactions? Because back then you don't have the data yet, right? You don't have the final complete data yet. So what kind of elements are you talking about?
Yes, so if I can use a hypothetical example here, right? So for example, if agency has published some of the guidances on alternative approaches, right, which we are all very appreciative of the efforts that has gone from agency. Now within those alternative approaches, if you see the general guidance, it is very, very vague, right? So the guidance talks about in bullet point that, okay, these are the additional studies can be done to utilize the alternative approach. What I mean to say is the next step, what happens from a generic applicant perspective, the applicant will take the crux of that guidance, which is at a very, very high level at this point, and then have a pre-development meeting and propose that, okay, the point number one, if you are talking about a realistic mouth-throat modeling, or if you're talking about a regional deposition pattern, etc., then this is my proposal, right? I can do that same thing. I can achieve the same thing through a complex PBPK modeling. I can also potentially achieve the same thing through a computational fluid dynamics-based modeling, right? So, but what will help, with the point that I was trying to make, is that when we put these options, most of the time, the answer that we get from agency is that submit all possible supporting data, and then we will make a decision. What I'm trying to say is that, yes, agency will, the applicant will submit all the data that we are generating, which is relevant, but it would also be nice that if we can know upfront in the pre-development meeting that, hey, you can use this particular part of the model as a primary indicator to justify, and the other information can be supported. So that way the applicant will know where to put more focus on. Right? Because as you will know more than anybody else, is that PBPK model development, some of these complex products, and especially locally acting product, it is a mammoth task. It's a tremendous amount of work. So if we can have that clarity in the beginning, probably it will help. I mean, I'm not saying that we are not getting that clarity right now. As I said, that the meetings has been very, very effective, and we can only do better from here working together, agency and industry.
Thank you. Chung? Yeah, and then Dr. Rostami. Chung, you wanted to make a comment?
Sure, yeah. Well, I think the guiding principle for modeling verification and validation is that the developed model or study design can discriminate two non-bioequivalent products. For the demonstration of the type 1 error, however, the requirements should not be more stringent than that for the current methodology recommended in the product-specific guidance for the product. For example, crossover steady state design is frequently recommended in the PSG for long-acting injectable. But as commonly acknowledged for orally administered products, single-dose design is preferred over steady-state design because steady-state design is less discriminatory. Hence, if it is acceptable for FDA to recommend steady-state design for LAI, I think other alternative design that has no worse discriminatory power than steady-state design should be acceptable too. That's my comment on this question.
Tausif, go ahead.
Yeah, just to take further what Pradeep said and how we can make these discussions more effective. See, traditionally, what we have seen is once we submit the dossier and we get certain deficiency or comments, and then we kind of submit the model or to kind of justify that. See, one thought process from a generic industry perspective is, again, can we upfront, I mean, submit the modeling work, what we have done? And it may not be the perfect, I mean, but at least the reviewers will have a chance to have a look at it. And it is not something very new which we are submitting, and then it has an impact on the review and the goal date, other things. So this is like what we want to hear, that will the agency encourage maybe not a exact, I would say, absolutely right, fully validated model submission upfront, where we could submit this. At least it will get a kind of a feedback during the review process. So this is something which I would kind of from a expectation from a generic industry perspective, because as we said in the beginning, I mean, we use model for multiple purposes. It is not only for prediction, it is also for even optimization of study designs, for selection of formulation. So we have the model, which is not the perfect model, which, because as we know, as we move along, the refinement of the model will happen. So what is the thought, I mean, comments that if we upfront in the dossier submit it, that this is the work which we have done, and this can be used to address some of the deficiencies which can come during the review to help save the review time.
Yeah, can I quickly add to what has been just said? Maybe again, this is just, I'm throwing a hypothetical proposal on behalf of industry. I think one way of increasing the adoption of modeling and simulation based submission would be, again, I'm just theoretically putting this in front of the panel for the discussion. Maybe agency can provide like an expedited review of the applications which are based on alternative and modeling and simulation based approaches. That will definitely help us, because we all know that when we are using alternative approaches, we are operating in a gray area. So the review is likely to become extensive, right? So if there is a path for agency, this is again food for thought, that such applications which are based on a novel modeling and simulation based approach or alternative approach, can the review of those applications will be expedited? So we know the feedback early on.
These are very good points. Liang, Lucy, Rob, go ahead.
Yeah, probably I can.
Yeah, so I have some thoughts on that comment, right? So part of it is, I encourage you, you sort of said, well, can we submit these sort of models with uncertainty, right? And part of the discussion there is, where is it better to handle these things, in sort of the pre-submission discussion phase or the application submission phase? Now, I know that the generic industry has some constraints here that maybe sometimes might lead us to non-optimal solutions, right? For example, like the first to file opportunities are so critically important to the business sense, right? You can't sort of say, well, I want to take a few more months and get my application right. I mean, that's not a, there's some just constraints around the system. But, I think we do aspire to make the pre-application interactions more relevant to, where sort of the exact submission date is not the issue. Some of this stuff can be done through the pre-application meetings, and then in GDUFA 3 now there's a pre-submission meeting to really say to that I think gets to some of the things you said. Can you say to the review team, here's what we're doing and here's how it's going to help what we're doing? So I encourage you to think about, in cases where you've done this, to think about that pre-submission meeting GDUFA 3 aspect, if it's eligible for your product, right? It's not, not every product is eligible for that. But certainly we welcome, I think Liang's very interested in this, on what types of programs we might pilot to, to sort of explore some of these things. But also, as you're on the industry side, as you're getting ready for GDUFA 4, right? One of the reasons we had a talk on the MIDDD program, right? That's something that in the PDUFA negotiations, right, was also supported by the industry, going through your trade associations and saying, this is some feature that will make our system work better. So you also, there's things that, that we can do internally to, to pilot this, and we welcome the feedback on this, but there's also things on the industry side as you prepare for that. So certainly welcome any comments from OCP colleagues on the MIDD sort of origins of that program and why it was successful in becoming part of the new drug development system is there has to also be industry stakeholders wanting that, right? Because it's, the negotiation process is a negotiation process, but, from my perspective as being directly involved in that, you're looking for win-win opportunities, right? And so if both sides bring something in that area, then it's much more likely to be successful. That's just my perspective of how the system works, is that, when there's proposals on both sides, then there's opportunity for compromise on that. If it's just one group pushing it, then it's a little bit harder. So, that's another perspective on some of the ideas there, which I think have some value. And some of them might be things that can be done in our existing programs, but some of them, might be fodder for either pilot programs or for proposals for future ways to make the system work better.
Yeah, definitely.
Just following up with Rob's comment, if our industry colleagues here also can comment, if we are hearing your need and a valuable input in terms of how to improve the current communication mechanism values. So particularly, I want to also, we also want to get your input. For example, if you have, number one, if you have multiple products using the same modeling approach, currently the mechanism, the pre-ANA mechanism is only, you need to submit individual pre-ANA meeting requests for each of the products. So do you have a need to discuss the same modeling approach across multiple products? The second question is that based on the chat box, you can see there are lots of questions more towards using the oral PBPK model to address some food effect, BCS waiver, and other aspects of the question. So the question to our industry colleague is that, currently there's no standing, there's the pre-ANA meeting is mainly suited towards complex products. But however, for non-complex products with innovative approaches or complex issues, would you like to have a venue to discuss with us? If you can also comment on those two aspects, that will gain us lots of momentum in terms of meeting your need, designing different ways to meeting your need in the future. Thanks.
So if I can respond to that question quickly. So if I understood the question correctly, you are saying that outside the purview of the complex, for the normal routine product, how we can use modeling and simulation, right? That's essentially the question is.
Yeah,
right?
Right. Yeah.
So I think many times, that when we talk about modeling and simulation, I think we somehow fixated to only one thing, is that this will substitute what, right? So modeling and simulation based work, whether it will relieve us from using a long clinical endpoint study, right? That's a standard approach that everybody buys in. Now I see other applicability of this approach as well, and those would be like, for example, a bio-waiver of lower strength, where let's say your similarity criteria is not meeting, right? Or where the formulation dose proportionality is at the borderline, right? So those are also the cases where I think there is a utility of modeling and simulation. I also see a tremendous amount of utility in post-approval, addressing the post-approval changes through the life cycle management of the product, right? Because through the life cycle management of the product, we are going to make, there are some changes going to happen: supplier change, material attribute change, component change, etc. Right? Manufacturing site change, particle size of the input material change. So I think that is another area where some of this can be utilized as well. And I also particularly liked the presentation from agency in the previous session on the long-acting injectable, where that we can cut down significantly on the time to run these steady state studies, right? So I think there are plenty of areas where that if we get a solid, we get ourselves into a solid footing on on developing these core capabilities, I think the utility of this is going to be beyond what we think generally, that modeling and simulation is going to replace a expensive clinical study.
That's great, Pradeep. I would like to make a quick comment on one of your questions earlier, and Tausif also. When is a good time to submit a model supporting your alternative B approach? Any time is a good time. The earlier, the better. At the pre-NDA stage, it doesn't have to be the perfect model. As long as you're transparent with us, what is the concern and how you will be using, you're planning on using, you would like to use the model to address it, we will be more than happy to provide feedback. The more data you have to support and describe your case, the better it is. But we do encourage very early interaction, and this is the main purpose of the pre-NDA program. So yeah, feel free to submit your questions on modeling and simulation early. I also wanted to ask, give Youwei the opportunity to share his experience and lessons learned from the MIDD program. So you have been hearing the industry representatives here sharing their opinion and our feedback provided back from the Office of Generic Drugs. Do you see the same? Did the MIDD program went through the same stages? Did you encounter the same challenges when you were trying to optimize this framework of interaction? And what are the lessons that you learned? What is your advice that you can offer? Your guidance?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I think I can share some experience with the MIDD pilot program. So I think I have reviewed 5 these programs and spanning different issues, including dosing regimen change and development of different routes of administration or innovative study design. And my experience with the MIDD pilot program is very positive. I think there's several advantages for this MIDD pilot programs and to discuss the product-specific issues in which MIDD approaches are being proposed. And the first is, I think, there's a direct, in-depth, engagement within the review team and also with the applicant. The pilot program for us is a venue which allows us to discuss the complex modeling issues and within the review team, and also it's a venue for the applicant to provide some clarity on their assumptions and also the application. And it's a platform for the FDA and industry interaction, and to obtain the specific feedback and to address concerns on the MIDD issues early on. And I think the second advantage is the focus. So this program usually have very short questions all related to the MIDD issues. So we can spend more time on these very specific issues related to the MIDD issues. But in other meetings, such as the end of phase 2, we usually very limited time will be allocated to these MIDD issues. So because we can spend more time on these very few questions and all related to the MIDD issues, and we have direct and in-depth engagement within the review team and also with the sponsor. And because of these features, usually, in my opinion, it is easier for the review team to align, on certain regulatory pathways to move forward, and we can provide more constructive advice on the modeling approach to the applicant. So I think usually some kind of agreement is more easily reached, between the agency and the applicant. I will stop here.
Thank you. I think this is very helpful. Pradeep, Tausif, Chung, you agree?
Yeah, can I ask a quick follow-up question on that one? So, obviously, we all have seen 4 or 5 examples that has been shown to us how MIDD-based approach can be used successfully. Is there a plan from agency to use the similar kind of approach on pilot basis or through other means for the generic drug development or kind of a final 5B2 drug development?
Would it be helpful to do that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's helpful feedback from you. We appreciate it.
So I think I just want to make a comment. This is very helpful. I mean, just to give the direction that earlier the submission, better it is, because as Pradeep also alluded, that in the life cycle management of the product, during the commercialization or post approval, there will be a lot of changes, whether it's site or it is a change in the dissolution specs. So it can avoid a lot of unnecessary clinical studies. I think one area which is also of interest in recent times is this gender difference. So if upfront we can submit, because there are certain cultural issues to have the female volunteers to be included in the BE studies in certain geographies. So that is also one area which can kind of address this, if we can support with a validated model or with a small subset, rather than having a equal proportion in our BE study. So that is also one area from an industry perspective, which we kind of see as a challenge, and this can also address this point.
Thank you.
Yeah, this Liang, I just want to make sure you hear our comment. We'll take your input very seriously. So we'll take some internal measures in terms of early communication and early sharing of our thoughts, and also probably address some of the unique concerns we are doing the modeling. Certainly, the a higher model value proposition is our interest as well. We want to adopt more innovative but a science-based approach to bring the high-quality generic drug product to the public ASAP. So this is our common interest. We'll take your comments, input very seriously. Thanks.
Thank you, Liang. Go ahead.
I want to make a comment. Yeah. So again, for the use of modeling and simulation, I think from a generic perspective, a lot has been said by Pradeep and Tausif. But I want to emphasize that I think the use of modeling to develop alternative study design is very important, especially because it can develop a methodology that can be applicable to many products. I think that will help us tremendously. For example, in the product-specific guidance for many long-acting injectable, crossover steady-state design is usually recommended. But as I said earlier, steady-state design is less discriminatory, and even more problematic is that because of the long half-life, it takes a very long time to conduct such a study. So I think if we can develop alternative study design that allow us to perform a shorter study, it will be very beneficial to the industry. Now, recently there has been product specific guidance published by FDA for the BE study design of 2 drug products, the long-acting intrauterine system of levonorgestrel and the etonorgestrel implant, which allows a shorter study design to complete. I commend FDA for publishing such an alternative study design. I think more can be done for LAI, for example, for antipsychotic drugs. Recently, in the FDA workshop on advancing generic drug development in September, I saw that Dr. Kevin Fang from FDA suggested a switch study design for LAI that takes a shorter period to conduct than the crossover steady-state design. I think this switch study design does not require in silico simulation or demonstration of virtual bioequivalent. I think this suggests design is promising, and I actually think that the design can be further refined to make the actual study even shorter. Fortunately, there's no time to further discuss that. But I hope this is something FDA is actively looking into for AI products, because it allows us to perhaps perform a solo study. Thank you.
Thank you, Chung. Dr. Lucy is intimately involved in these studies and the research around them and the regulatory works. Lucy, you have a comment?
Yes, I really see a lot of passion from our industry colleagues on the similar program like MIDD from in the generic drug. So I would really like to make a request to our industry colleagues. Can you guys help us explain to us or document it in terms of value statement from industry perspective? How do you want to, what in your view, how this possible pilot program can help you, and particularly in terms of how you want us to operate this? And I think with that kind of perspective from you guys will really help us plan this if we decide to move forward in that direction. Thank you.
We have only 2 minutes. Can I have a quick response from industry? And then I would like to give Dr. Rostami the opportunity to provide a comment. Pradeep, you're already unmuted.
So no, definitely, Miss. I think we can. I can coordinate with the rest of the industry colleagues in this panel, and I think we can put together some kind of framework from industry perspective as to how the applicability of a similar program like MIDD could be useful for the development of some complex generic, some value-added generic, some specialty product. Many times we have no other choice but to make a non-Q1, Q2 product to get out of the patent. Yes. And that could be another scenario where some of these could become very, very important. And at some point, obviously, as the science progresses, probably I also see a lot of utility of this on large molecule as well. So we can certainly take that as an action item.
Thank you. Dr. Rostami?
I think there were comments on the, sort of the chat box that people were putting, saying that, we are almost, in the same position that we were 15 years ago. So the issue is basically, I'm talking about, sort of how, in the case of OCP, I think Youwei explained that many of the things they have basically settled. We are not going to get rid of the fact that for some area, that you guys in the OGD and in the EMA the same, you are asking for more experience, and this will be de-risking the sort of eventually what people are putting in, which is our industry colleagues are asking for. But having look at the process of how we came in the OCP with some of those areas and reached to that point, I think it is very important that when there is a positive case, that positive case, I'm not talking about creating a recipe with sort of all the details that they are confidential, etc., but giving as close as possible the process that involved in that positive case. Of course, many of the industry in generic, sort of will try, at the early stages when still the risk is high to take their chance. But I think once, that is there, if the recipe book as close as possible is very sort of become public via, for instance, Eleftheria, you have published on, of course, dermal, with Liang and others, become sort of a step-by-step process saying that these are the steps and these are the important part of those steps that we really sort of cared about, and this made the decision one way, yes or no. I think that will definitely help the industry colleagues to say, okay, we have got a path, and sort of it is this much risk associated with it. It is not 100% versus 0. It's going to be always somewhere in between. So I think the publicity and transparency of the cases that they have happened definitely will help, and the more we do that, the faster we go through this 15 years difference, I will say, between what happened in the OCP versus what we are having here.
Yeah, we publishing and making successful case studies available to the wider audience is our priority at OGD. Definitely, we're making every effort to publish. manuscripts, speak at conferences, and share our perspective. We do have 3 more minutes. We were given extra time.
Eleftheria, if I may, can I make a
yes.
comment, follow up on this? I think Amin brought up a good point that, MIDD in new drugs, there's so much experience being gained. Actually, our philosophy in generic realm is to even further advance the impact of modeling, given the knowledge, information that have gained in the new drug development, pre-marketing and post-marketing. We really want to take advantage of the knowledge and the data that are being accumulated. We don't want people redo everything. In that regard, I think in the generic drug realm, we do have kind of an advantage to sit on the top of deeper or higher information and understanding of the drug product. So if by taking an integrated approach, by integrating all the knowledge, the in vitro testing, the understanding of the formulation aspects, so we kind of been promoting using model integrated evidence for generic drug assessment approval. I think that together with the industry, we can deepen the impact and promote the value of model in the real implementation of bringing high quality generic to the market with a linear regulated pathway, but quicker. We gain the public, the general public, quicker access to the affordable medicines. Thanks.
Thank you, Liang. And we, unfortunately, we need to end this panel discussion. We already at 10:29. I would like to thank everyone for all our panelists and speakers for contributing to this session and a very engaging discussion. We were planning on talking about low-hanging fruits. There's no time for that, but I believe that if you continue attending the workshop, the rest of the sessions, we will be able to identify those cases where we can work, all of us together, to advance modeling and simulation supporting alternative B approaches. So thank you very much. Enjoy the break for 5 minutes and please come back for session 2. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for moderating it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.